Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.42, The Kingdom Sundered. In episode 1.39, I left King Solomon dead, somewhere between 931 and 927 BC. His realm split in two. The two kingdoms would never be reunited. They never got on, brothers though they were. Really, they hated each other's guts. For the first 40 years of their coexistence, they engaged in endless raids over the long-suffering tribal lands of Benjamin. For the 40 years after that, the kingdom of Judah was a vassal of the kingdom of Israel under the house of Omri. For the remaining 120 years of the life of Israel, until 722 BC, the kingdoms were sometimes friends, sometimes enemies. They were rarely best buddies. The Davidic line reigned in Judah for more than 300 years, with one brief interlude. Most kings died in their beds or honourably in battle. Israel was racked with instability. The Israelites obviously had to reject the royal Zion theology that claimed that God had given a monopoly to one house, and that the headquarters of this monopoly was Jerusalem. Only 2 of its kings died in their beds. 7 Israelite kings were assassinated or executed. Time and again, the old king would die, his son would come to the throne, then the son and the entire royal family would be exterminated. The leader of the rebellion would be enthroned to start yet another short-lived dynasty. Only 2 of its royal families, that of Omri and Jehu, would hold the throne beyond a second generation. The impression that Kings and Chronicles try hard to convey is that the 2 states were comparable in strength, or perhaps even that Judah was the superior power and Israel a recidivist fragment. The archaeology paints a very different picture. At its height, the northern kingdom of Israel could boast a people 500,000 strong. The kingdom of Judah perhaps 25,000. Israel was wealthier, more urbane, more urbanized. It is Israelite cities, Samaria, Jezreel, Hatzor, and Megiddo, not Judean cities, that show the earliest traces of monumental public buildings. In Israel, we find evidence of manufacturing, a substantial olive oil industry, and trade activity. Judah, nothing. Judah was a tiny rural rump, its capital of Jerusalem, a village of maybe 1,000 souls. The only other town of comparable size in Judah was Lachish. That's it, 2 towns. By the time of the 2 kingdoms, the international trade that had been smashed during the Bronze Age collapse had been restored. Once again the wares of Arabia, Egypt, Greece, Asia Minor and Mesopotamia could freely move on boats and donkey trains. Israel was a natural junction of trade routes. No trade route passed through Judah. Judah's neighbours of Moab and Edom were poor and sparsely populated. Israel's were rich and populous, the Phoenicians, and the kingdom of Aram Damascus. Even most traditionalists now accept that Israel was an industrialized, populous, urbanized power. The contentious issue is just how hillbilly the Judeans were. The traditionalists contend that Judah was a tiny but perfectly formed kingdom, with a solid monarchy and a bureaucracy to support it. Many modernists deny that. They argue that Judah was an illiterate rural hinterland with a barely functioning central authority. Our primary biblical sources for the divided kingdom are the books of Kings and Chronicles. The story of just David and Solomon occupies 34 of the 102 chapters in the history of the monarchy that starts in Samuel and continues into Kings, about a third of the total. The other 350 years of the two kingdoms are tersely recounted in 36 chapters. That gives you an idea of how important the author, the Deuteronomist, regarded David and Solomon. Kings is a book of failure. All the glorious treasures that Solomon had bestowed upon the temple are gradually pillaged. In the time of Solomon's own son, the Egyptian pharaoh Shishak plunders the temple. 30 years later, the Judeans send temple treasure to the king of Aram Damascus as an incentive to divert his armies towards Israel rather than Judah. 70 years after that, the Judeans again pay protection money to Aram Damascus. A century later, further treasure is sent to Sennacherib of Assyria after the destruction of Israel. And with the destruction of Judah, the Babylonians take everything left. A better title for Kings would be How the Hebrew Kings Failed to Follow God and Were Destroyed. Not a snappy title. In its narrative of the two kingdoms, Kings follows a set pattern. The rulers of both Israel and Judah are introduced in turn, in chronological order of accession. They get a potted biography about how long they reigned, their family connections, and what they built. The Deuteronomist regularly sticks his editorial oar in to theologically evaluate each king. Good Judean kings are those who follow a strict worship of the one God, sampled on his temple in Jerusalem. These paragons of virtue also stamp out worship at rural shrines. In short, they protected the monopoly of the Jerusalem priesthood. No Israelite king gets a good rap. Having rebelled against the line of David and the temple, they have no redeeming qualities. In Kings, monarchs who sacrifice only at the Jerusalem temple are praised, regardless of their other deficiencies. Those who do not are condemned, no matter what their other accomplishments. The Deuteronomist is quite aware that the historical record doesn't lend itself to this kind of interpretation. There are some good kings who reigned very briefly, and who suffered disaster. And there are some very bad kings who reigned for a very long time and died happy, like King Manasseh. This most wicked of all kings reigned for over 50 years, the longest reign in Judah's history. The Deuteronomist has a way to explain the inexplicable. He invents a theology of delayed punishment, deferred punishment. So the division of the United Kingdom is blamed on Solomon's misdeeds in allowing foreign altars for foreign gods to please foreign wives. But the punishment was deferred until after his death and the time of his son, and then God sundered north and south. Wicked King Manasseh was punished 2 generations after his death, when the Babylonians destroyed Judah. You may be thinking, how does that punish a wicked man long dead? Yes, quite. Where Kings devotes significant space to the northern kingdom, Chronicles ignores it, except where it impacts Judah. Chronicles doesn't accept the theology of the Deuteronomist. When the chronicler needs to, he rewrites the history of Kings to remove those ideas. Chronicles also presents us with something that Kings does not. Yahweh as a God of compassion and grace, not a God of unrelenting and remorseless vengeance. Chronicles gives its readers hope. Kings knows only failure. Apart from Kings and Chronicles, we have some indirect biblical evidence for the two kingdoms period. The prophets Amos, Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah provide considerable insight into the life and times. They addressed the political situation of their day and sought to inform their compatriots of God's will for his people. In their pronouncements, we get glimpses of the inner dynamics of Hebrew society. They denounce faux religiosity, economic injustice, and government corruption. The prophetic oracles against foreign nations tell us what at least some Hebrews thought about international affairs. As I stressed in episode 1.41, one of the major developments in biblical studies since 1990 is that scholars now take very seriously evidence from outside the Bible. That simply was not the case before. Before 1990, no one was concerned in assembling a comprehensive codex of Mesopotamian manuscripts, nor was anyone interested in textual evidence from the Hebrews' neighbours. Since that time, scholars have produced substantial corpuses of readily accessible, deciphered translations. One thing we have learnt from these is how often the Bible's story is not supported by other material. Both the books of Kings and Chronicles provide sequential lists of the kings of the two kingdoms, and even synchronize them. That gives us a floating chronology. In theory, that can then be matched to the absolute chronologies we have for the Assyrian and Babylonian rulers. We have extensive records from Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt that enable us to piece together a chronology for the Middle East as a whole through the entire Iron Age. The Hebrew kings and kingdoms appear rarely. There are several important benchmark dates we can derive from Assyrian records. For example, we know from his inscription that Shalmaneser III of Assyria fought Ahab of Israel at the Battle of Karkar, and we know that this occurred in 853 BC. But the floating chronology of the Bible does not let us establish when in Ahab's 2-decade reign this happened. It is impossible to reconcile the Bible's dating with Assyrian records. The inscription of Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria records that King Menahem of Israel paid him tribute in Tiglath-Pileser's 8th year. That would be 738 BC. The inscription also records that the Assyrian king placed Hoshea on the throne of Israel in 732 or 731 BC. According to the Assyrians, no more than 6 or 7 years transpired between Menahem and Hoshea. But the Book of Kings records 2 other monarchs between these two, Pekahiah and Pekah, who together ruled for 22 years. Kings itself is inconsistent. One chapter of Kings records Jehoram becoming king of Judah in the 2nd year of Jehoram of Israel. Yes, the same name. I'll get to that interesting story later. Another chapter says he became king in the 18th year of Jehoram's predecessor, Jehoshaphat. Yes, there really is a Jehoshaphat. He is not recorded as a great jumper. Many kings have 2 names, which the Bible uses on a mix and match basis. That doesn't help make things any clearer. Finally, the Septuagint sometimes has different reigns from those listed in the Hebrew text. One minor headache is that we don't know what sort of calendars were in use in the 2 kingdoms. At various times, the kingdoms began their year in autumn, in the month of Tishrei. At others, in spring, in the month of Nisan. This happy muddle persists to our own time. The first month of the modern Jewish calendar is Nisan, but the new year occurs in the 7th month, Tishrei. There were also various methods for dating the length of a king's reign. In one method, if a king died in the middle of a year, the period to the end of that year would be called the accession year. year 1 of the new king's reign would begin in Tishrei or Nisan. In another method, the months to the end of the year would be year 1 of the new king, and year 2 would begin at the commencement of the new year, maybe Tishrei, maybe Nisan. We also don't know how many co-regencies or joint rules there were, where double counting may have attributed years of one reign to both monarchs. Scholars have debated the years of the Hebrew kings for generations. The proposed dates are typically not far apart, usually within 10 years or so. In this podcast, I will use the dates proposed by J. Maxwell Miller and John Hayes in their 2007 book, A History of Ancient Israel and Judah. I have a great table at my site, www.historyinthebible.com, that compares all the scholarly dating systems. A casual reading of the Bible might give the impression that the two kingdoms were key actors in international affairs, but they were really rather modest monarchies. Were it not for the Bible, they would no more be mentioned in the history books than the kingdoms of Ammon, Moab, and Edom. We only have a few important written artefacts. An inscription of the pharaoh Meneptah that I mentioned in episodes 1.6 and 1.24 places the Israelites in Canaan during the time of the Judges, around 1220 BC. The Egyptians don't mention the Hebrews for another 300 years, when their pharaoh Sheshonq describes his invasion of the Levant, sometime after 950 BC. Sheshonq records no king and no nation, just a list of cities. Next up is the inscription of King Mesha of Moab, describing his victory over the sons of Omri of Israel, erected sometime between 850 and 800 BC. That's the earliest non-biblical reference we have to a Hebrew king. Sometime in the same period, an impressive monolith created by the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III gloats over his victory over Omri's son Ahab. In another inscription, known as the Black Obelisk, Shalmaneser commemorates the deeds of his later reign, which include kneeling on the neck of the Judean king Jehu. Move on to 800 BC, and we have the famous Tel Dan stele. This is a broken stone left by a king of Aram Damascus that celebrates his conquest over King Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of the house of David. That inscription contains the very first reference to David outside the Bible. In 738 BC, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III recorded his victory over King Menahem of Israel. Our final artefacts are from about 700 BC, where the Assyrian kings Sargon II and Sennacherib describe campaigns in Judah against King Hezekiah. So, what would we know about the two kingdoms if the Bible did not exist? Not much. Scholars would argue whether the name translated into English as Israel in Meneptah's stele, written in hieroglyphics, or in Mesha's inscription, written in Old Canaanite, or in Shalmaneser's monolith, written in Akkadian, meant the same thing. There would be no reason to suppose that a kingdom of Israel existed before Omri, the earliest king mentioned in any inscription. On the contrary, scholars would probably conclude that Israel had been founded by Omri himself. From Assyrian inscriptions, we would know that Omri's son Ahab of Israel was around in 853 BC. From other Assyrian and Babylonian records, we could identify a few other Israelite kings from the last decades of Israel. We would have no reason to suppose the existence of the kingdom of Judah before Tiglath-Pileser III mentions kings Uzziah and Ahaz in the late 8th century. Now, let's get back to the history. Solomon's son Rehoboam was the heir designate. His confirmation was not a matter of course with the northern tribes. He had to journey to Shechem to attend an assembly of Israel. Probably the northerners had already indicated dissatisfaction with the house of David. David's family connections were with Judah. The cult places and priestly lines of the northerners had been sidelined in favour of Jerusalem. The ancient sanctuary of Shiloh, deep in the territory of Ephraim, had been sidelined by the temple, and its most sacred relic, the ark, taken to Jerusalem. When confronted with a demand to change Solomon's harsh policies, Rehoboam replied with a line that would make a supervillain proud. Quote, 1 Kings 12:11. And now whereas my father did lade you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father hath chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. End quote. The northerners raised the cry of rebellion that had been heard before in David's reign. Quote, 1 Kings 12:16. When all Israel saw that the king had not listened to them, the people answered the king, We have no portion in David, no share in Jesse's son. To your tents, O Israel. Now look to your own house, O David. So the Israelites returned to their homes. End quote. No doubt twirling his moustaches, Rehoboam tried to put down the sedition. Quote, 1 Kings 12:18. King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the forced labour, but all Israel pelted him to death with stones. Thereupon King Rehoboam hurriedly mounted his chariot and fled to Jerusalem. Thus Israel revolted against the house of David, as is still the case. When all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent messengers and summoned him to the assembly at Shechem, and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. End quote. The Israelite assembly at Shechem showed no fondness for the dynastic principle. They had rejected a man with impeccable hereditary credentials. I don't quite understand why they decided on Jeroboam, though. He was Adoram's predecessor in the taskmaster business. Jeroboam had spent years lashing Israelite labourers for King Solomon. He only abandoned the job when Ahiah prophesied that he would inherit most of Solomon's kingdom. Perhaps the Israelites respected Jeroboam's defection from the disliked dynasty. There is some confusion about the number of tribes. The passage I quoted says that only one tribe was left to Rehoboam. Traditionally, the kingdom of Judah consisted of two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Long gone Simeon doesn't get a look in. But that leaves only 9 tribes in the north. Maybe the unlanded Levites were added in to make the 10. But that can't be right. The Bible says that Israel expelled them. Oh well. The Hebrews now had 2 kingdoms. In the next episode of the History in the Bible podcast, I describe the first decades of their troubled relationship. Before I finish, 2 notes. First, as usual, I'll talk about the 2 kingdoms as the Israelites and the Judeans. When I want to refer to both combined, I'll talk about the Hebrews. Second, I'm also going to mix and match Hebrew and English pronunciations of the various monarchs. It's often easier for me to mispronounce the name in Hebrew than mispronounce it in English. I'll see you next time.